right, so floodplains. This is covered in Part 2, Chapter 13 of the PD&E manual. So the primary resource for guidance on FDOT projects. So it outlines a procedure for evaluating project impacts on the 100-year base floodplain and provides guidance on how to document floodplain analysis in the Location Hydraulics Report, or LHR, and environmental document. And so these instructions are based on 23 CFR 650A. Okay, so what is a floodplain? A floodplain is any land area susceptible to being inundated by floodwaters from any source. And the base flood is the flood, the 100-year flood is the flood or tidal event having a 1% chance of being equaled or exceeded in any given year. The base floodplain is the area subject to flooding by the base flood. And the flood insurance rate map is FIRM is the official map of a community on which FEMA has delineated base floodplains. All cross drains have an associated base floodplain. So what is an encroachment to a floodplain? Any activity or construction within the floodplain, including fill, new construction, improvements, and other development. So encroachment examples are extending existing cross drains, embankment fill, or proposed cross drains and bridges. So significant encroachment is rare on DOT projects due to Section 4.4 of the Drainage Manual, because we are required to meet local community requirements on cross drains design, and any increase in backwater shall not significantly change offsite land use values unless flood rights are required. So the Location Hydraulics Report will describe the type of construction activities near floodplains and include a description of the measures to avoid or minimize floodplain impacts, and must be reviewed by the district drainage engineer to verify that the floodplains are identified and it is consistent with the Basin and Floodplain Management Program. So the results are summarized in the preliminary engineering report. So project floodplain impacts shall be assessed for all FDOT projects which involve activities near or within the floodplains. However, not all projects will require a location hydraulics report, even if they're near or within floodplains. But we still must document in the environmental document the projects not requiring an LHR. And this is based on the encroachment type and the environmental document type. So if you have no encroachment, then an LHR is not required. But if you have a minimal encroachment, depending on the environmental document, you may need an LHR. And an LHR is always required for a significant encroachment. Okay, so that when an LHR is not required, even if for a minimal encroachment, is the non-major state action. But if you have a minimal, you'd probably be in the into the type 2 and SEER. An LHR is required for a type 2 and the SEER with minimal or significant encroachments. So LHR documentation, Chapter 13 provides a detailed list of items to be discussed in an LHR. So a few of those are summarized here. So drainage, basin, cross drains, history of flooding to the existing facilities, locations of floodplain encroachments, practicability of avoidance alternatives and or measures to minimize impacts, determination of the impact on regulatory floodways, consistency with local floodplain development plan, and results of any risk assessments. Statement, final drainage design will be done in accordance with the FDOT drainage manual and design standards. So the LHR should also include discussion of risks associated with implementation of the action, the impacts on natural and beneficial floodplain values, the support of incompatible floodplain development, measures to minimize floodplain impacts, and measures to restore and preserve the natural and beneficial floodplain values by the project. So the level of drainage analysis, so you'll need detailed calculations for every cross drain associated with a project. Oh, should be avoided. So never mind. So detailed calculations for every cross drain in the project should generally be avoided. Impacts to flood elevations and limits are minimized by designing cross drain facilities in accordance with the FDOT drainage manual. So examples of when calculations are warranted is if you have a long extension of an existing cross drain, or to determine preferred alternative for a new alignment. So for alternatives with similar floodplain impacts, a single analysis for all alternatives may be appropriate if it's obvious that they're the same. Okay, so Chapter 13 also lists additional documentation. So measures to minimize floodplain impacts associated with the project, practicability of avoidance alternatives to significant encroachments or support of incompatible floodplain development, and estimate both the existing floodplain volume and the volume of the encroachment. Flooding impacts to private property both upstream and downstream. And if you have a bridge structure and the BHR is not prepared during PD&E, then you have to include the conceptual bridge length and scour considerations and clearances both vertically and horizontally. Okay, so summary statements. The report shall include a statement that affirms the type and impact of the encroachment and addresses consistency with local floodplain ordinances. There are 6 sample summary statements in Chapter 13, and if it's appropriate for the project, use one of the sample statements as is. If you need to, you can modify the sample statement as necessary to adequately affirm the impact of the encroachment. Okay, so risk evaluation. So we know what risk means. The consequence associated with the probability of flooding attributable to an encroachment. It shall include the potential for property loss and hazard to life during the service life of the highway. A risk evaluation must be included in the LHR. An evaluation of risk should include the following. So risks to transportation infrastructure and users and to residents. So the FDOT recognizes 2 types of risk evaluations. A risk assessment is typically appropriate for minimal encroachments, small structures, and structures whose size is not influenced by hydraulic constraints. And a risk analysis is typically appropriate for significant encroachments anticipated to increase or substantially change floodplain elevations. So the district drainage engineer in consultation with the PD&E project manager will determine if the floodplain encroachment is significant and what type of risk evaluation is warranted. So a risk analysis is going to, be a higher burden than the risk assessment. So a risk assessment is just subjective analysis of the risks resulting from various design alternatives without quantification of flood risks and losses. It may consist of developing the construction costs for each alternative and subjectively comparing the risks associated with each alternative. So for example, you have a rating scale of 1 to 5. to evaluate the risk to infrastructure, the risk to users, and the risk to residents. Whereas a risk analysis is going to encompass a comparison of alternatives using expected total costs. So you're going to have to actually calculate the risk cost for each resident, user, and infrastructure to determine the alternative with the least total expected cost to the public. And so the risk analysis is rarely needed for FDOT projects because complying with FDOT and the design requirements results in minimal changes to flood stages. But if you do need to do one, see Chapter 4 of the FDOT Drainage Design Guide. Okay, so points to remember for floodplains. Most FDOT projects with floodplain encroachments, the encroachment will be minimal due to abiding by the FDOT and WMD criteria. Documentation requirements depend on the encroachment type and type of environmental document. And Chapter 13, Part 2 of the PD&E manual is the primary guide